Dhargye chujurun yubel sonam jen dolan peje sanjen dobaran sonan jen dolan peje sanjen dobaran chedan zoje jonan la janjo badon donen janjo Dhargye chujurun yubel sonam jen dolan peje sanjen dobaran
Suje tabje to tojala na ya da ba do be sanje ko bo rin bo ji na ga ta ba shi de chi de ta be shi se nya be ko san ju se je ma se je se ta na sa ba ji
I would like to remind all of ourselves to take a moment and cultivate the bodhicitta motivation or the altruistic motivation seeking complete enlightenment for the benefit of all other sentient beings. And with that kind of at least contrived bodhicitta motivation, we should participate in this discourse on mind training like the rays of the sun. I'll read a couple of pages from this Lojong text, mind training text called Mind Training Like the Rays of the Sun, to give you the blessing of lineage oral transmission, followed by explanation, starting from page 117.
Jupara Ganzini Jimmy Pumbo in Bazawa causing and Trevor at the end of the Dami Parasumbe, the long Jimmy K. Guijo, Guyan, Pumso, Long, Moyan, Below, Jimmy J. Moyan, Below, Demi Javaran, Vinola, the Cecil. Kansani jeba peme papa soje khoro khobo da tarbo to so da hi pobo de ne da ba yin la pobo to ju so ba jin jun da jun je kha sa kha mai de na xin da la ye la pong lo so lo de ne da ba yin ji de ya la de ge da cho ba kha xin da mai ba yin xian da do ye shi da ye la so lo电信的就把些地方是那的，我就是些到些考上就职得到呢，我为的可能有的做为讨上不是的，所以那些把些这个的这个招收的这考到了，这个得了不？我说现在我得了不？当我有了得了不？当我那当没这到去了这的说。这方面把到电这些电子送给大米被电子就没有了，电子，他们上去了到这个上到连接进进路，我是把那些的我的学生都在这共同就共事就，你的这结果呢，得了爸爸拉考上上新街州那我的我这他的考上就这个。听了些都抽到没把了，抽到没把了，他这话的天天是碰手机就好了。大家说这个在电台没人把那把这个行这对大没对才没有这个在。电台先把那把这个最近完了，这到底搞弄了，面到最近的。考研没有考研，买一把没别做，我把小康啥都不让个这这，要是这完了，这把送别他们打开了不同那个做，大不让个新鲜这边，那些这那得了，都别落能得了，都别落能有了嘛，对吧？就是这让这把弄有就。 西北老一辈是北农人的调到跑上的不离说明我农些农业老我这我东松说地这都不你。他说都别对路现在也不都得人到底了，到不都对人了，到别到能去通过了的，再能到不的了。听见他的那么老板觉得的，快乐能主动与人间的这退学与人的这让人学这个让人这没事。这都听见也我的，你也我的，没几的那的也我的，没几就就是的你。东我他的都那我走哟，老别说着都是老别说着的呀。这到那碰不到联系呗，别是看啥去了，不都没觉得个大碰不能做这事。天天没得这我咋些的，让我两把毛做不，那你也没别大有毛人去别的，让我给你打那最近打你没把也些什么，你把大碰不叫我。大碰那么也别到这对面去，这个也那看啥这了，碰不都没也把他，看啥都没也把这一样，那碰不这个对，那碰不那这对就是看啥这的也没这也没是的对那没说的就把，这对碰不到那这些地方也到这碰不这些说不。这是真的，到我那考上这个不，我写我到考上这个写吧，写过了上学去这边写呗，这个上学去到的考入里面到听的第一嘛是第二没第一个没的到这边了也是。现在大家没看啥，都不的，那边对面这的就是的那，现在也看啥都不是我都让他继续吧，看啥希望马上就是这边这个没看啥，那到那么也的没这也没是，让继续让到我继续别这样，我没看啥都不的没希望的这吧就。现在看啥的那也得没这没这的那没有这边大部分没现在咋些的对，他没的的给的他的没那的那把这些些事，才我以为对没，看啥那个这这边这些他的那电影了这我没有的大这边这我没的。第二那些他这边是的，第六个这我没的，第一这了，然后我给别第你，这了就然后我给别这那些这玩意儿对吧？这到那头了，这边这我晓得没用，对不对？到了这玩意看样没这就把。看到了这些说我的到去到我这我也写说就没那叫我这么叫我这么对吧？就得能多这么的也了。像这个别看啥给的理解我那么去是我就得这个可能给讲没用。看到就别看啥些用没事这地方看啥的我写这不对了弄这吧的没些把它，这吧觉得第一句我可能给叫我们什么看到就这个别写这个啥么样晓得别写。这在看啥的不让这边上也是把老那些那么这边老那边也把这我在呢。讲我晓得上路上那当年都要用我看啥都不，我觉得给那个问题让你心里长心个人来说，看啥都我不那个自己就这个人，他这那这些嘞给的不到也不来，那些不自己没我觉得是说话都不对是错的。这你进去了说呗，进去那时候他们的我觉得没得我觉得， 大跑到这我他这别的这个天你们的我心里头的当然这也是我们这帮去些的当那考察当时年纪没多人见没把没让我这别的那个的娘的些那些然后这个风波也没别些的用我娘别了绝把嘛也把些把觉得考察风波然后这觉得我也他这别些的这别那么朋友我他这风波没别些的要那不我娘不懂那不没别些的用我风波我娘别了就没叫些呢这咋些的等于你我来把现在这把嘛你看这些那我来没把风送哟这那送对面这次就把来这这风波来到别的风波把这这么多些的这说的那些考察部的这个他这边这边的这他的那个里边多些然后这他的可能对我这边菜참지 거는 참자고 왜 집에 거사는 심에 동안에 벌어 또 배sem이 예바 세명이 같은 희라된 배 장버 쳐오 나한테는 힘든데 그래서 거사다 나 참시와 총도 거가 파가는 되는 수 있다 다음에 때는 되더니 들어야 거사 다음에 때는 봐 쉬다 민신이 인텔이야 담보 강사 담에 때는 버지디 체니 인 강사 담에 때는 버지다 담에서도 저기다 타예디가 다지다 깜지 다시여도 뒤다 기도다 타예디가 다데 인 시자모 도데 저런지 테루 생기도지다 런지 문제 되게 인 다데 그게当中的 니야 세이开些的 시바도开些 부부 유는 소소문도 그래서 마보래서我这里我认识，他也里边大的，他也边大的，他这个刚就个当没考察，当没周围的大没就大的，看下子了要，大你的确实当没的考察，大你看看下呢，让就没就看看下我说，刚才看看下呢，那听叫个那确实定的嘛都这了，那刚才可能我那钱吧要么的是。我的现在这我的现在我这些，他人路到位下个年是他的人物了要考察看的下个是，就把我这里没风波，也把早干净是，但我这里就没把是的，我这里就没把在我下个了吧，我下个你这那风波下那风波的我嘛你这地里嘛了吧，现在那。就别找了呀，碰过俺这里没外边干啥是提前。那这完了电的大别大没不送别是大，碰过电的大别那都不当时俺的那俺这里就没关系送下去。我就没教过形式，我看见他的俺这里这些可是那。这里面我也不老就没教，可是现在人我也不老教嘛是吧？然后现在我这老教的嘛，就我也不老教也嘛是我这都过的是，我这年纪没过得了，那我也不老年纪教过的是。他碰上那我也不老居民介意，居民介意。我年辈老点没叫啊，然后女对别是实行不着。碰上了我年辈老居民，这我有我们老居民碰上了是，我年辈老家里我也是这下。这我年辈老居民这个嘛是碰过俺老婆俺碰碰我都我碰碰。俺老婆俺过生的就嘛我听见是。碰上了俺家老居民我家老居民要让女儿这边实行是，有的时候上我们用到的程度我说是。那大你这把后面他把说句话报道，他不说，到时不报的大把也了。碰不出云错的，错把的云的云节看啥嘛？这边呢，新大人也了， 펑로솔 때네 ene taba yinje teda rewa de choba khoya xingda ma ba xian des dole cheda yin la zo na la dian di xingda jiwei di yi bu na de工作世界学校写说是da di de ka ta yi de khang sa da da de ya ta yi de khang sa de da le gao yi khang sa da ma yi xie ta yi de khang sa xia ro我的通过记他的康要么都被当什么都要把手机没记得那当中这你有看的了的要么现在干啥都被当什么都是通过的你要么是我的的就别弄的的程度现在他也的康啥就是门上的千万的
Geshe read from page 117 to page 120 to give us the blessing of lineage oral transmission. We are back to page 117, the third paragraph from the top. As Geshe explained that we have already talked about the risk or the fallacies or the problems of overestimation of the object of negation, that is going overboard to identify the object of negation or the object of refutation, or the risk or fallacy of underestimation of the self that's being refuted, which in other words is not refuting enough of the self. And then we talked about how do we establish selflessnesses of a person and phenomena. Of these two selflessnesses, we first deal with the selflessness of a person and then the selflessness of a phenomena. And so the thing that we should remember is that there is a self that exists conventionally. We can call it Thanyebenga or conventional I or a self. Yeah? But then there's also the kind of self which is presumed to exist, but it doesn't exist. That is the self that constitutes the object of negation or refutation, right? Self that's being refuted, the Gakjenga. So those two selves are not one and the same thing. So we are trying to make a distinction between the two selves, if you will. And according to Buddhist schools of thought from Sevatandika Madhyamika, a sub-school of middle way philosophy, all the way down to Vaibhasika school, they assert that the self, they assert either the self of a person, or if those they accept the self of person and phenomena, they make a distinction between the self of a person and the self of phenomena, or the selflessness of a person and selflessness of phenomena. They are not one and the same thing in their schools of thought. But according to Prasangika Madhyamikans or Umatengyuba, the selflessnesses are exactly the same thing. There is no difference between the selflessness of a person and the selflessness of phenomena, qualitatively speaking, because they are exactly the same thing. The only difference we can find between them is the basis upon which these selflessnesses are established. Right? The selflessness of a person is established on the basis of person's aggregates, and the selflessness phenomena is established on phenomena. So in terms of the basis, we find differences, but in terms of what selflessness actually is, according to Prasangikas, the selflessness of a person and the selflessness of phenomena are exactly the same thing, ditto. Okay, that's what the Prasangika says, but of course, Sevatandika Madhyamikans and other schools below, they differ. Yeah, so those are the things we already talked about. And then, of course, in the other Buddhist schools of thought, they kind of assert that if you look for that conventional I of the self, it should be findable. Okay? And then we ask them, what is that person or a self, according to you? And then some of them said, it is, the aggregates, or the Sagandas, And then in other higher schools of thought, they say, no, it is the mental consciousness, or it is the mind basis of all, isn't it? Alayana Vijnan. So they come up with, examples of what they thought that is self, actually, person, isn't it? So it should be findable. But according to Pasangika Madhyamikans, self is nothing but a mere designation. Okay? It's an imputed reality. And you cannot find it just the way they presume it should be findable. Okay? So according to all Buddhist schools of thought, when we experience this innately developed I or person, lenje, innately developed lenje, the focus of the object, mikpa, of this conception is self or I. Okay? Of course, some of them said that self has to be aggregate, that self has to be mental consciousness, that self has to be mind basis of all. Whereas Pasangika say, no, it doesn't have to be any of them. As a matter of fact, it is not. It is just an imputed I. Okay? So that imputed self is the focus of our innately developed sense of I or conception. So many of them said aggregate is the self, but they said no, aggregate is the basis of designation for self, because we really, when we think of our head or arms or any part of our body, we said my head, right? We don't say head I, hand I. Nobody say that, right? It's my head, my arms, my body, and my mind. So therefore, what is mine cannot be I or the self. So conventionally speaking, self is just a mere designation onto a collection of aggregates, psychosomatic aggregates. The example given here is that of a chariot, shingda in Tibetan, right? A chariot. And a chariot is nothing but a designation onto, right, its basis, which is the collection of all the parts of a chariot. So it's just a mere designation. It's not something you can find ultimately. Okay? Neither is the whole collection of chariots the chariot, nor is any of its parts a chariot. It's just the collection upon which the label chariot is given or designated. Yeah, and it functions as such. Exactly like that, according to Pasangika's, self or I or person is merely designated onto one's collection of physical and mental aggregates. Okay? Neither the continuity of aggregates is the self, nor each of any of the aggregates is the self. It's just a collection upon which I or the self is merely designated. Right? So these are the distinctions that we have to kind of make and understand.
我这些考上，你婆婆当时嘛都要嘛的少这些，他考上你结巴朋友泡泡49，等他吧没了说是，当时婆婆了带的大把人了是，他考上才考这些个呢，带就考这结巴朋友3周，他有的人是泡泡49 3周，你考啊。 不的，你考完了出这个，他把头给他为了去给这要看这些那么些呢，可是刚刚今晚这边看啥可以要不我老师可以不我这些要就出对门这就要嘛的，我的看啥看这些呢，不我当东西嘛都，你这不我里呀，我他的到不这个不的咋的要嘛的，你看啥，大把人了，不从运的。 속바 유제 가야 가자 많이 됐나 신다라는 게 아니라 봉보 때네 딱바 인제 뒤연라 저저 속바 가야 신다 많이 왜 신데스 어디 다디 빼들어다 뒤에서 신대 빼 가자 다음에 때라 봐 빼들 신가 약속 있어 봐 저기 다음에 저가 될 다시 저거 왜 저기 그리고 어디 있어 저들 신다 될 라바이나 될 수가다 신다 될 배다 이제 신다 그런 게 속성서나 영화가 그 루루 시작으로 다 속배 유세계 제가 시세 속배 이앱서도 속다 되죠 어디에 가지 독재되잖아 가지 뒤에 가가 신다 되고 말데 그래서 제가 现在的人那个小鸡都是这蹦下的，现在有个他是这当有了哇。现在的人那这都差不多看也有么的，我听那些考上不摸这他的，这个让些这个站的要么的是，我这是我这么的。
So we are still on page 117, the last paragraph. As Geshe explained, a person or a self is nothing but a mere designation onto his or her collection of physical and mental aggregates called skandhas. That's all a person or self is. Okay? And of course, we can differentiate among humans in terms of gender, right? There are males and females. And in terms of qualities, we can talk about ordinary sentient beings and transcendental or Arya beings because they are highly realized. So regardless of our realization differences, regardless of our gender differences or any other differences, as a self or a person, we are all same in that it is a mere designation onto a collection of physical and mental aggregates. There is no difference at all in terms of that mode of existence. It's not like some human beings, they kind of exist in their aggregates. Other human beings kind of exist outside their aggregates. They're very different, right? It's not like that some human beings, and their aggregates are identically one, or some human beings and their aggregates are, different. Different from each other. It's not that. It's just that every self or a person is a mere designation onto his or her collection of aggregates. And so how can we understand that better? Of course, we can use many examples. So in terms of establishing how self of a person exists, or the selflessness of a person, perhaps the best example is that of a chariot, Shingda. Okay, as you find it mentioned at the end of page 117. Yeah, in the sutra, Buddha himself talks about this, that when we look at a chariot, right, it has many parts. Okay? But we know that if we analyze it in 7 different ways, the 7-fold analysis of a chariot, what is included in that analysis is that neither the collection of all its parts is the chariot. If that's the case, then we can dismantle the whole chariot and just heap it up. All the collections are there. That heap collection of all the parts is not a chariot. Okay? Nor is any specific part of the chariot a chariot. It doesn't constitute chariot. Nor is the shape, right, that's formed after fitting everything together, that is a chariot. And so we can analyze the chariot in many different ways, and ultimately what come to realize is that we couldn't find chariot in any of those 7 analytical ways, and chariot is nothing but a mere designation onto its basis. In the same way, a self or person is not findable among the aggregates. Neither the continuity of the aggregates, which is constituted by the many moments of aggregates, is the aggregate, nor is any of the individual aggregates a self or a person. It's just the aggregates constitute the basis upon which self or a person is merely imputed. Okay? And as Geshe said, that after we deal with the selflessness of a person, then we talk about the selflessness of phenomena. And the best example, it is said to understand the selflessness of phenomena is through the analysis of 4 modes of production, isn't it? Production from self, production from others, production from both, production without causes and conditions. Right? Through that kind of analysis, we are able to understand better selflessness of phenomena.
龙这个扩大的在成个什么龙个长要么现在的其他人了做呢了是新的人了做吧的那新的大把的跟你看啥的这一的普遍那的呢工作是些些工作是的个同大把要么是看啥工作上的要什么同大把要么是个什么他的了呀这就的了开始这就对起的他看啥的新的这样这就对是那么对起的我是的吧现在这个看这然后人了的那开始让心之外他的些他的特别这些那的新的人了对吧人了新的对吧人些的新的嘞新的可能人了对吧这些的那的了开始新的错东西错别业些我提定的在那么定是吧他错中的错别业的的头发是这样嘛的错中是的人了是不帮小的是吧错别业是的熟的如果看上这样嘛是吧业是的熟是吧我提了头发是这样嘛的他现在的头发是我的了是的说那刚才前面讲过的头发的他的些的让是这个的了刚才他的讲过的啊他的碰过的这个些的了刚才前面讲嘛就当刚才碰过你进嘛是吧进面上刚才前面讲过些他就个单的嘛这个因为按你新大的原来的新的兄弟原来的新的也在原来兄弟平时代表去你些但新的可能原来的吧个原来的嘛的那个你比如当用吧个现在原来的吧些那错别也是错什么我的对的我就这地方当中是在你那这个在现在的这个错别错什么是因为新的人呢因为新的什么这些刚刚谁的就是这贡献呢这里新的这样嘛我头路上路过了我是路过的时候的但是那业是的那个首先就我的那看啥说嘛是吧现在业就我的新的人嘛我的拍头嘛这头发凶是吧他从什么的嘛的从什么那新的人了不也都看啥可是新的有他个联系但那错别业的那底下别人家要嘛的业个首先是吧看啥那碰过去操作业些没些要嘛是吧看啥业是就所个业的这个我记得看啥业是没些要嘛是吧看啥所有的业有说是吧我就看啥过来了真的看啥业的这有啥要嘛是吧我这些我这在呢我觉得大地现在快点有啥那这定的呀现在的人了我是让把这些讲去说的老差的不刚刚这个是吧我听那人的看啥不过当时的可以这种就也不有啥你看啥当没带了把我来你摆着的也很现代意识是吧你可能现在可能定的我说没感觉通的别原来这个就是的心就洗了我就要我嘞意思是
그냥 다들 각자 자 먹어야 되긴 풍부의 직세대 자 먹어져로 하게 랑신도 가서 자 고사디 타대체 편집 땜바디체 땜바디체 네가 가서 잡으러 가게 입다 초과를 잡고 있는 봐 입다 초과를 양 잡고 먹고 랑신으로 so at the bottom of page 117 we have a stanza quoted from a sutra that highlights a chariot as an example to demonstrate how a sentient being or self or a person is designated conventionally onto his or her collection of aggregates. Okay? And of course, anything that we find in the Shastras or commentary authentic treatises, we should be able to trace it back to sutras, what is stated in the sutra. Of course, we cannot quote every sutra, that would be too much. So here we got a citation from a sutra that really, hits the mark, where it talks about the similarities between a chariot, Shinga, and self of a person. So as Geshe explained, that there are similarities, we can think in terms of 7, between a chariot. A chariot is something we can all look at, right? It is a very visible thing, a chariot, and easier to relate to. It's not an abstract phenomenon. It is a concrete, right, under your nose kind of a phenomenon, the example. So we can do the sevenfold analysis. Yeah? The sevenfold analysis is that, now we ask the question, what is chariot? Okay? So is chariot, one or identical, with its basis? That, conventionally speaking, right, we can understand it is not. Right? Chariot has so many parts, so it is not exactly identical or one with, its, basis. Now we have to say, if it doesn't exist as being one, ditto, identical with its, basis of imputation, then is it something that exists separately, differently from its, basis? Now, for this, we have to qualify this difference with intrinsic difference, okay? Or truly existent difference. Yeah? And so, does chariot intrinsically exist as being different from, as being separate from, as being, from its basis of imputation? Right? Those are the two things, right? Sevenfold analysis we're talking about. The third thing is that does chariot intrinsically depend upon its parts, right? We're talking about the dependent relationship between chariot and parts. So does chariot intrinsically depend upon its parts? And then we look from the other side, do the parts intrinsically depend upon the chariot? That's true, isn't it? So here also we qualify this kind of dependence as intrinsic dependency between them. So that should be 4. Okay? And then the next one we say does chariot intrinsically possesses parts, right? Demba. Does the chariot intrinsically possesses its parts? And so that's should be number, what is it? 5. Then the next one, we don't have to qualify it with intrinsic characteristic. We said, is the mere collection of all the parts of a chariot a chariot? It is not, as we said before, right? We can dismantle the whole chariots, and then we can just heap it up everything. All the parts are there, right? They are in a collection heap. But nobody calls that a chariot, even conventionally, right? So that's the 6. And then we can say, conventionally, is the shape, right, that's visible to us. When we fit every part of the chariot together, is that really shape that's visible to us? Is that a chariot? And it's not. So even in the world, I don't think anybody will say. But on other issues, yes, then there are differences, isn't it? Is chariot identical with its, all of its parts? Or is it intrinsically different from all of its parts? Or does chariot intrinsically depend upon its parts? Do the parts intrinsically depend upon the chariot? Does the chariot intrinsically possess, intrinsically? So now the same analysis can be done with the self of a person, right? We can say, is the self of a person identical with, all the aggregates of the person, conventionally speaking, okay? Or does the self of a person exist intrinsically as being different from the aggregates? Okay. And does the self intrinsically depend upon all the aggregates? Do all the aggregates intrinsically depend upon the self of the person? Does the person intrinsically possesses all the aggregates and the parts? Isn't it? And is the mere collection of the aggregates that person of the self? Is this shape of a person, shape a person? As a matter of fact, self has no shape. Right? When we say shape, we can only talk about the body of a person that has all kinds of shapes, but the self doesn't have a shape. Yeah. So as we analyze the person in all those 7 ways, so we don't find the person to exist, intrinsically. So as Geshe said before, so this 7-fold analysis of a chariot, the 7 similarities between how chariot exists and how self a person exists, is the best example to understand selflessness of a person.
Kansa ke zuzun de tabu ne se ngobu de kona nyotu tope ta sambo shik des. So the namje paji chukun la ti rig de shows o ti dajidan de en tonyu dobe riba pena riba riba kota nazo karku na divorce shina da riba zo de kodon sha ya de ngen lo cha de go yo she da Kansa dangme ten boya la en namdi riba ti be tab song shu kansa dangme en do ya tab song shu de res. She da tele be kwa ya bo sha so na en ko chuje kha du gur me de je ram sing to se ti te ram mo chu ti kansa da shue she da yan la ga jik ba re go ro no re so en kansa te ya bo ko sha so na en ti ya en so na je ba shue ta ji ri ba rin je ya res so na je ba shue se na ga de te ro ta shi jin do ya ni mo sha che en ngab ji za so de ga ngab ji za so she namja shue ngab ji za nga shi do be ya de ga ja ji sa ji ji go ro no so o de ga ja de ji sa de 就是大康是去到的呢，天那么多学校嘛，他就他们这个是天那样的嘛，就是他在康上是把这办家呢，人学生看不嘛到，人家别个让些有这边嘛这么吹的地花的，康上的花上嘛些，人这学生开始从那地顶把开些嘛些我认识。
So we are on top of page 118. We just did one page or less than a page so far. So as Geshe explained that in the Buddhist sutras and treatises we find many different types of reasoning and analysis to be able to approach selflessnesses. And here in this present context we are dealing with a very particular analytical technique, which is called the seven-fold analytical technical reasonings, to understand the selflessness of a person. If we really understand this analytical technique, we can apply it to a chariot first, which is easier to deal with a very visible, concrete example. Then apply it to self of a person. If we truly understand this reasoning and analysis, then it's just a matter of focusing on any other subject, topic, and we can apply the same analysis and we can understand the selflessness of any phenomenon. Right? In the Buddhist terminology, right, when we talk about very inclusiveness, we said everything between the form and the omniscient mind. That means everything that exists. That's our way of saying. These are the two categories. It starts with the form, it ends with the Buddha's mind, omniscient, anything in between, right? That's our way of saying that anything that exists. Okay, this is because, as Geshe said, in the Buddhist treatises, when we look at maybe some of the important key topics, there are 108 of them, so 53 of them deal with afflicted side of the phenomena. And the 55 of them deal with the liberated side of the phenomena. In other words, it deals with the path to liberation, freedom. And the 53 of them deal with all the yagadi headaches, right? That affliction, that drives us nuts. And so when we say from form to omniscient mind, all-knowing mind, we include all these 108 topics. So the point, bottom line, is that if we really understand this sevenfold analysis or analytical technique, and we apply it to the self of a person, and we really understand how self does not exist intrinsically, now we can use the same technique, apply it to any other phenomenon. It's just a matter of shifting your focus to any other phenomenon and understand how that phenomenon does not exist intrinsically. Okay? Nice.
这我是得了康萨人心没我点了，不打的听着康萨人心没我点了，怕把拉阿把拉，我人心没我点了，怕把当，我有人心没点怕把我是，这个打康萨当没是的，咱那 Kansa de nga de nga yu zin jigsa se ni sha wo ro. Si de nga ra shi be de fa shi. Ta di de nga yu si de nga se nga so nga jig shi sa se ji. Yang yan kwal jig sa se wo de samu na shi don ko ra shi de ni yong do. Wo de nga se de nga mu ni chi de nga ra shi de de shi. Nga yan ko se nga la ko se de nga yu le se wo ro. Wo de mu cha wa do shi de shi ya le. Yeah, and nga ra shi me de na de nga yu ra shi me de na pa se ni sha re si ho wa. Ta thang bo ne da me ge ta ju le je be che jing ju ju so ri ma mi ba dang. Den zu so an ge da mi be se den zi la den zi yong me ba den je. Tong ma rong yu la se da de khang sa dang zi lin ji je xie. Zulu was a bass. There's a near shed this, not here seeing those. That, and the Kansas countries, and Puma then a Tama some race that Titagiti Kansas saying was this some Lord Shagora.
No.
That's all Zulu and Puma Tama something the Sidala Puma to me Lord Chag or dish him to China, taking Nakora saying the Lord Yena. In Nazi Lenji Zimaya, Pig Ten, Papa, you tell him, Metal to go. Oh, direction, Kazak say it together, Musina, and Nazi Lenji, Tibetan Buddhism, and the Kuya Rabbit, yellow chair, or she the Kazak and say you over 1,000. Share in the Kazak. Teaching the Tita and so Lohenji, Shatan Kandid, or this that. Because Oman Juba got to your Gomora Sile. Children Toba shall look at and tell the Dinzi the lot of Mos or Siajua. So Tobe shall do the Shensuna. In the Koran Rotan temple in Mevshe. And so by some going in Gas, it is the Tobe Tazon law shall the Koran Kala Madu, the men was Ling of Chow there, or Tikuyi Kodun of Shena, in the Lela, or should I think Kodushi Lago, it's the Karsa. So she the Tatilla, and they were two dog moves on the Azura. No, because the dog moves on the dress what I got. Kansakorangunes and easy to condense to it. In so lot Shatan to the lazy Naki Chipare to me do a Tagora. No, or that Chipa may have Hakos, that is got going to see to or this what.
No. We're on top of page 118, second paragraph, right from the top. So as we talked about, that there are two selflessnesses, selflessness of a person and selflessness of phenomena. And with regard to the selflessness of a person, there are two things that we have to deal with or keep in our mind. One is the sense of I, nga, and the other one is sense of mind, isn't it? So we have grasping at both I and mind, and these graspings constitute grasping at the self of a person, and these are called jikta, transitory views or views of transitory collection, because these are associated with our mental continuum, if you will. Okay. And so we understand the kind of the difference between I and mind, right? And the mind is like, my body, my arms, my head, my hair, my nail, all of this mind, right? Oh, somebody did something to me, And so there is a distinction between the I and mind, we call it, isn't it? So we have a grasping at intrinsicness of I, and we have the grasping at intrinsicness of mind. And so to be able to get rid of these graspings, we have to understand selflessness of a person. And so as Geshe said, that person or self is nothing but a mere designation onto his or her collection of physical and mental aggregates. Right? That is the contention, isn't it? That's how a person or a self actually exists. Okay? And so now, the most important thing, right, the first thing first, is we have to precisely identify the object of negation, what's being negated or refuted, the self. And we already talked about this a lot, right, as the text says. So we just take this contention. It is said that self or I is nothing but a mere designation onto a collection of physical and mental aggregates. If that's how it exists, how does self appear to my innate conception? Does it appear as a mere designation on a collection of aggregates, or does it exist as independently, intrinsically, and a very fixed entity? Ling-ling-wa, this is like right there, the thing is there. Yeah. So if you see the difference between, how self appears to our innate conception, that it appears as if it exists in and of itself, independently, intrinsically, fixed entity, here I am, right? And then in reality, there is no such self. It is just a mere designation on a collection of aggregates. Once we see the disparity between the appearance, namhka, and how it exists, right? Then, we started to get some sense of what the object of negation is. In what way self does not exist. It does not exist intrinsically. We get a sense of that because it exists dependently and designatedly, but it does not appear to us in that way. It appears to us as being very independent, very fixed entity, And so to be able to see that kind of a distinction is to be able to verify, how self actually exists and how it appears to our mind, and our mind gets tricked. So that's the important thing, and that's what we talk about identifying the object of negation. So we have to look within ourselves. Okay, the contention is self is nothing but a mere designation on collection of aggregates. Is this how the self appears to my innate conception? No. It appears to my innate conception as being intrinsically, objectively, independently out there existent, right? But it doesn't exist that way. This is how we have to be able to see the distinction between the appearance and how it actually exists. And so then we can verify the truth of the matter, if you will, right? Yes.
Well, this is because Tiri kaji da dhamma driva tila ya mani dhenda mami gemi ya mani dhenda mami wo tini karong si yin kore sha ti ta lawri su ma sha chik tuti yung do chik tuti ti tezi lo cha la re si wo kaji kawsa ti pike pungpa taksam si yu anu sudo pa chao di zon kawsa toba taksam mayo dodo ro chao di zon ta ti yu na kari pungpa da ka ya da pungpa da chik re do ye ta ti ro kare re wo dung chiba si yu zon in the Pumbo the Chigina in the Terra Carsa. Tata de Da Puchina, Da the Pumbo Nagati, Pumbo Nagati, in the Pumbo Nayu was in the Da the Nayu Kushara. Yaman Da Jimmy, the Pumbo Jimmy to show, and Chigi, the Tadi in the show. Tadi is the darling on the Tadi on the Chimida Tadi said, Mary. Pumbo laws you are there, Tadi, the Pumbo because Shiro had Pumbo Kadem Gaje, Kura Kala did was it, or did you issue or what? She needs that you change the Yaman to Makaru, she don't know about the chick, the Yaman for what Tadi Chara. No. He shall be the bottom of Yaman chick, Yaman, you take Tinin Daria, Sheba Subashia Mora. No. But this Java she was not any. Karsa Pumba Jin any Pumba Jin, Yaman Daji Mujime, the Pumba de Pumba Messingari do this. Yaman the Pumba Nayan, Da Nari do this. No, then is a jig de Goroa. No. That did Timena, Tate in Debate on Yakabu Nigeria, Pumba Madu Dari Yogurt, Pumba Madu Dadi and Semi Mugo, Mammy Basis that. People must be das as Shiro Ranjata das as Shagor Matizil. Not the one is the Pumbol Tati, go type da Yomara. Or should that 可以你要么这个，要么他的第一可能是第一可能没呢，没被掐着。现在这是他这个就那风波我也是大我也是，要么那风波这么一没，可是大这么一没风波这么对吧？就要这，要么呢，但是可他的理由呢，那风波跑刚刚深，说刚刚深的，人说大上嘛这个都是，人搞电视就看嘛就有嘛了。我这没着。我这头的他的啥的老人子刚刚，这头的电视的我说我的呀老强的我是说他。
We are still on the second paragraph from the top on page 118. And as we mentioned earlier, that there are many logical reasons or analytical tools we can use to approach selflessnesses. And earlier we talked about the use of sevenfold analysis or analytical technique to approach the selflessness of a person. Okay? And the other reasons I've mentioned, the two of them mentioned here in this paragraph, is the reasoning of singularity and multiplicity, or the reasoning of one and many, or identical and difference. Chik tade, right? How beautiful it is to translate Tibetan word in too many English words, isn't it? Chik means one, identical, or single. Tade means difference, many, and that's what we're talking about to approach selflessnesses. And so as Geshe explained, the reasoning of one and many, or the reasoning of singularity and multiplicity, or the reasoning of identity, identicalness, and a difference is really often talked about in the Lamrim treatises, Sacred Path Enlightenment, because relatively speaking, they think that's easier kind of reasoning to apply. Why? Here's the thing. If something exists in general, well, whatever that X is, X, Y, Z, whatever the X, Y, Z is, if something exists, it could exist in only two ways. Either it has to exist as a single entity or phenomenon, or it has to exist as multiple phenomena or different phenomena. There's no other way, isn't it? If something exists, either it has to be one, or it has to be many. There is no third option, because these are mutually exclusive categories. If something exists, either it has to be one, single, or it has to be multiple or many. Okay? That's in general. Now we use that framework logic to say, if something were to exist intrinsically, the same rule should apply, isn't it? If anything were to exist intrinsically, in this particular case, self of a person, then the self of a person either must exist as one with the aggregates of a person, identical with the aggregates of the person, single, right? Or it must exist as being different from the aggregates, or as being, how should I say, multiple, different from the aggregates. But there are problems on either side. A self cannot exist intrinsically as being one with the aggregates. Why? Because there are 5 aggregates at least. So which means there has to be 5 selves, which is not feasible, isn't it? As many as the aggregates are, there should be that many selves. And that's not possible, right? Or just as there is one self, I, all the aggregates must just collapse and become one. And that's not true either, isn't it? So there are many problems if we say that if self were to exist intrinsically, hypothetically speaking, right, then it would have to exist as one with the aggregates. Right now we check with that, and that's not working, isn't it? It couldn't be one, because if it's a one, then all the aggregates must become one. Or, just as aggregates are many, the self must be many. So this is the problem here, right? It couldn't and doesn't exist that way. Now, that if a self were to exist as intrinsically different from the aggregates, then it has nothing to do with the aggregate. It should just exist, right, out there by itself. This is what many non-Buddhist schools of thought talk about, right? They don't talk about relationship between aggregates and the self. They say that self or the soul or whatever, Atma, it's there, independent by itself, right? Something different from the aggregate, because that's the Atma, soul somewhere. Yeah, and that's not possible, And so this kind of, the reasoning of one and many or singularity and multiplicity, what it really precludes is that for true existence or intrinsic existence, there cannot be, a relational existence here, right? True existence or intrinsic existence precludes relational existence, deva, connectedness, right? Connection, relationship. That's not possible, okay? So the reasoning of dependent arising is really to preclude that there cannot be intrinsically, antithesis, intrinsically existence, right? Gelwa, right? Intrinsically, how should I say, existent antithesis of any phenomena. Yeah, nice.
No, there, because I think to this, I did that. Tell ya, it's a low so big. Sheva to it. Sheva so is the Dharma to Yagi. Later, will jig to the density. Short, he was.
Nice.
Low link density and then gaming density, young Yagazi. Karsana. My calling those jig to the Yago. The density said, and then show you that Chavazu Domogos in the Katakotuba. Bell just shows you because I shows you that Chavazu Domogos. Katakoran began. Where to young gaming days at the Yaga.
No,
Make change total solo method, the only image, now motion the city. It called now almost solo method, I think on the sea in Hakogoro. So call ya now time with us, Cheva Yamara.
No.
She had the total now almost the total solo method, cemetery, Unto Chabati, dodging out of the bell, just draw the Yahu years are here. GTC do the young which you did to a young today to did remember more of
No.
That is remember over.
No.
Critical version to go.
No, sir.
Or direction the Sheda need to Kajita my shitty worry.
No, sir.
That 10 day things said, that 10 day things says, regret you, but 10 day things say, she will young zero.
No, sir.
Carissana. 10 days the 10 citizens, this is what Carissa. You have a course, you are.
No, sir.
Jail citizen, Kaza Rangi Mato, days the Rangi Mato, jail citizen, Yobaku or
No,
she said, 10 days said the take the Kodon, Rangi Meva, the Yobajinka Soya, Kodon let to Orish.
no,
She has a qualia, repeat Yevas, Jizend of the Teres water.
no,
She that go Gajakaya, go Gajaka, tissue, Guns of Doyak, Shitayamara.
no,
10 days they got a 10 days you go on. Tiny Gassia, the Nibayo, teacher, rebate you see the The Kaji Damage, giving that and then I knew you my queen carry, you carry me chatter.
no,
But the chat is that. Oh, this said that John me was said that in the daisy John me was said. Daisy the chiro that so in the Koyama, but you did another Moga, you did another Dujato Marawa.
no,
Said that this is Yatago, they said to that, this is John me was then, yes, I did tease at it.
no, so
Jeves, Thomas, you are that the Kaza, then yes, Zulu was the nations, or that because the Gaza was in the nations, I did it.
no. We are still on the second paragraph from the top of page 118. And those two reasonings we just talked about, there is the reasoning of one and many, or reasoning of singularity and multiplicity, that precludes, connectedness or relational dependency in the case of true existence or intrinsic existence. And then there's the reasoning of dependent arising that precludes, inherent intrinsic contradictions, in other words, okay, intrinsic contradictions. And as Geshe explained that, for example, some great masters like Acharya, Shanta Rakshita, he kind of prefers the reasoning of one and many, or singularity and multiplicity for ordinary people. He thought that's easier to apply. Kind of reasoning, because should something exist, it must exist either as a one or as many. Okay, and neither does it exist as one nor as many. It means that thing does not exist at all. Now the same idea can be applied to intrinsic existence. Should anything exist intrinsically, either has to exist intrinsically as one or intrinsically as many. When we couldn't find anything to exist intrinsically either as one or or as many, then that thing does not exist intrinsically. Okay, so that's easy to apply. That's what the Acharya Shantarakshita and some masters talk about. But then other masters like Acharya Baba Viveka, talks about prefers the reasoning of dependent arising. That really precludes intrinsic contradictions, if you will. So that's because that among all the reasons, the reasoning of dependent arising of pratit samutpat tendal is called the king of reasoning. Yeah, why? Because if you look at the word or the term that dependent arising, tendal, ten means dependent, and dal means actually related. Now in English we said arising. Yeah. The word ten, dependent, indicates that the thing cannot exist intrinsically. So it kind of refutes by the word itself. Dependent means something cannot exist independently, right, intrinsically. And the del, relatedness or the arising, it means that something is not non-existent because something exists. So the dependent arising itself, that reasoning, it eliminates the true extremes, the extreme of eternalism, taktha, and the extreme of nihilism or cheta. Other reasons are there. They can only simply refute true existence, but it does not somehow, asserts or establishes existence of things. It simply says what doesn't exist, it could not exist in a way, but it does not say anything about existence. Whereas the reasoning of dependent arising, it not only refutes the intrinsic existence, but it asserts how things exist conventionally. So therefore, it is the king of reasons. And as Geshe tried to put in a very syllogistic form in the monastic debate system, where we can say that, for example, I faculty cannot, look at a form, because just like the ear faculty cannot look at form. So in other words, the eye faculty cannot intrinsically process a form. Just like the example is very easy, right? The auditory, perception does not see form. It only deals with sounds, isn't it? So, but there is no eye faculty that intrinsically can, relate to form. So, in other words, just not to complicate the whole matter, in the Buddhist epistemological reasoning, when we talk about the whole logical framework, we have to talk about all the logical characteristics, the necessities, right? The logical privation and establishment of the reasoning on the predicate, and then in the relationship with the subject and the predicate and the reasoning and all of that, right? So that's a whole lot of things to talk about. So we don't have to deal with all that headache when we have that kind of a reasoning. So it's just kind of easy, it simply indicates the intrinsic, contradictions.
까버려 말버려 디레지마 시쇼 말어
no
저 가도 있는 말보다 까버거 쟁 말어 뭐보다 세워들 열어
no
现在看手机，可能看到小人那打把西就是吧？
no
现在的打把西小个时候是，尤其是今天的看出中国人子，今天的看出那没先打把西小的是，的是不啦？的，但的可以啊，都的意思个是吧？我第二现在那什么的，这是的话，可是结婚时呢，有人上了当呢，看这出国这个那个大的这个。 상로단 비게 지하들 지금서 그러와.
no so
나 상로단 다 디렌도 지레샤 상직 차거라다.
no
어디샤 디가 샤야 돼 그래. 조금서 그러와.
no
어디서 샤.
no In the middle of page 118, a big caption reads, of the two meditative techniques, analytical and formal analysis is as follows. And so now Geshe explains that as we talked about earlier, should something exist, right, that it has to exist either as one or as many. One and many are exclusive categories, right? There cannot be third option. Either, it has to be one, a singular phenomenon, or it has to be multiple phenomena. Okay, there's no third option here. In the case of a vase or a pillar, right? A pillar exists or a vase exists, and we can say it exists either as a one or many. There's just a vase, that's a one. Okay, there are vases that are many, right? So it either has to exist as one or as many. There is no third option here. Okay, if something doesn't exist as one or many, that thing could not exist at all. Yeah, so we can easily conclude that, right? It's very definitive logical framework, right? Either this or that. There is no third option. Yeah. But if the categories or the analysis is not definitive like that, then we cannot have a conclusion. The example Geshe given is like, say, we talk about color, right? If we ask the question, if it's a color, is it a white or a red? Well, we cannot have a definitive answer, right? A color doesn't have to be white or red. It can be blue, it can be rainbow color, or it can be yellow for that matter, right? So that cannot be a good analysis. We can arrive at any definitive conclusion because a color can be other than white and red. Whereas that's not the case. If something exists, it must exist either as a one or it must exist as many. If it does not exist either as one or many, then we can be very sure, comfortable, definitely say, well, that thing does not, should not, cannot exist, period. Right? So that's why the reasoning of one and many or singularity and multiplicity is a very definitive tool, right? Analytical tool to analyze whether there is intrinsic I or a self. If there were, hypothetically speaking, then it would have to exist either as one, single, or it would have to exist as many. So when we analyze it, we couldn't find either it exists intrinsically as one or as many. Then the conclusion is what? It does not exist intrinsically. Okay, so that is the definitive conclusion. So when we analyze like that, we are using critical thinking, we are using reasonings, we are using logic, analysis, examination, investigation, research, whatever words you want to use it. So that part is called analytical process and meditation. Okay, Qigong, analytical. So once at the end of the analysis, we come to the definitive conclusion, intrinsic self could not exist at all. It neither exists as one nor as a many. Then we put our mind on it, single-pointedly. So that meditation is called Jogom, right? Single-pointed placement meditation. Okay? This is how we do the analytical and single-pointed meditations. And we will stop there today, and we will answer your questions if there are any. Let me first write down the page number. Okay, Losala, you have any questions? They have no question. Okay.